Navigate to main.storyboard, and with the collection view selected, bring up the Attributes Inspector. In the second section, you should see an option to specify the layout. While compositional layouts are brand new at the time of this recording, flow layouts have been around a while and are baked right into Interface Builder. As you can see, the layout has already been set to flow because this is actually the default. The first attribute you need to specify on a flow layout is the scroll direction. So right below layout, you should see a property to set the scroll direction. Make sure this is vertical. Because a flow layout is a line-based layout, by default, this means that the data will automatically be presented in rows. When a row reaches the edge of the screen, it will flow on to the next. If you were to select horizontal as the flow direction, the data is displayed vertically in columns. Notice immediately the difference between compositional and flow layouts. When creating a compositional layout, you specified the scroll direction at the group level, which meant that you could have different groups with different scroll directions. Using a flow layout, this property is set at the entire layout level. So that's the big picture. Next, let's navigate to the Size Inspector. Here you can customize all the various aspects of the layout we discussed, including cell or item size, spacing, and content insets, amongst others. If you can't see these properties in your Size Inspector, make sure that the collection view is selected in the document outline. Up at the top, you can adjust the cell size by specifying a height and a width. Unlike NS Collection Layout Size, which allowed you to specify a size using both absolute or relative values, here you can only do the former. Let's keep it at 50 points for now. Right below are attributes for header and footer size. You haven't touched on any of that yet, so let's skip right ahead. The following section covers minimum spacing. First up is the inter-item spacing, or the amount of space between cells. For lines indicates the inter-line spacing. If you were to tweak these values, it doesn't actually make any visual difference in the editor because we only have one cell on screen. Let's fix that. In the Attributes Inspector at the top, you should see an Items property. You can set any value in here to display that number of prototype cells. Let's set it to 15. This won't mean that you will have exactly 15 cells when you build and run. It's just a number to display as prototypes in the scene. Now you can play with cell and line spacing. If you go back to the Size Inspector and modify these values, you should see how it affects our layout. This is a pretty big advantage of flow layouts. Given that you can set many of the properties inside Interface Builder, it means you can quickly get visual feedback. Let's set both of these values to 20. The only thing that remains here are the section insets. Remember that section insets reduce the amount of space available to lay out items. If you increase the value for the left attribute, you can see how this comes into play. Right now, you have 6 items or cells that fit in a single line on the iPhone 11 storyboard scene. This is with an inter-item and inter-line spacing of 20 points. Once you start to increase the value of this left section on the Section Insets property, you can see how all of this comes into play. As the available space per line is reduced, the flow layout will first decrease inter-item spacing until it hits the minimum value that you specified. Once the inter-item spacing is at a minimum, an item is then pushed onto the next line and the entire layout is adjusted. The spacing between items is recalculated as each line is laid out. If you keep increasing the section inset, you start over by first decreasing the inter-item spacing and so on. Okay, let's reset this left property to 0. As I mentioned earlier, there are some fundamental differences between how flow layouts and compositional layouts work. In addition to scroll direction, remember that when creating the compositional layout, you adjusted each item by adding a content inset at the item level. To achieve that same goal with a flow layout, you need to think in terms of content insets and inter-item spacing instead. With the flow layout, this is also applied equally to all items, whereas with the compositional layout, as the name implies, you can compose different sets of items and groups together to create varying layouts inside a single layout object. Before we move on, let's reset the number of prototypes back to 1. Build and run the app to ensure that we haven't introduced any errors. When it loads, you should see an empty screen, and that's because the app doesn't contain any data yet. Let's handle that in the next video.